and co-author of the U.S. Human Rights Network's Political Prisoners State Repression Working Group report to the UN Office High Commissioner for Human Rights on Political Prisoners and State Repression. She observed the U.S. first appearance for UN Universal Periodic Review in Geneva, obtained a preliminary UN UPR Working Group recommendation calling on the U.S. to release COINTELPRO civil rights era political prisoners, and is currently campaigning for its final adoption. Welcome.
In some ways, I feel as if I've gone full circle, you know, to have lived through the days of Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, raids on the Black Panther Party office, people being marched out into the middle of the street, butt naked, humiliated, mail being opened. You know, I've lived long enough and been active enough to have gone through this before. And what pains me most about it is that so have others, and those others' names are not even known. People like not just Mumia Abu-Jamal or Leonard Peltier or the Cuban Five, but Mondo Longo, Ed Poindexter, Rochelle McGee. Nearly 100 people who've been in prison for almost 40 years. 40 years. And they were just the wave for my generation. I think that to make this experience meaningful, we really have to hear what the history that Lewis just described. I've concluded that along with the myth that the U.S. Constitution is a human rights document, when it is in fact a commercial document, is also the myth that this is a country as opposed to a super military installation, the object of which is to provide material, technical, and military support to a ruling elite, individual and corporate. And all parties, whether within the confines of North America or domestically as we refer to it, or internationally, abroad, are consigned to servitude in service of that elite. And it is not until we begin to recognize that reality and deal with the phenomenology that recurs in support of it that we will begin to have an accurate analysis and develop an effective strategy. We cannot talk about whether or not a decision is the decision is made, sisters. So you all need to get your little knapsacks and your toothbrush ready, and who's going to take care of your children when you're gone. The decision has been made that you will be the distraction for this generation that allows this cycle of corporate control to distract the general populace while further wealth and resources of the people are dissipated and exploited. I was at a meeting at the White House, not this past Wednesday, a week ago, on behalf of the nearly 100 political prisoners of war and exiles that the United States has held and traditionally deny exist, asking that the recommendations made by the Cuban government, God bless them, the people of Cuba, and the Venezuelan government, called upon the United States in November to release its political prisoners, including the Cuban Five, Mumia Abu-Jamal and Leonard Peltier. And while we've managed, we meaning the U.S. Human Rights Network has been able to put U.S. political prisoners, all of them, not just the two whose name we know, or the five we've come to know, but all of them, nearly 100 people, on the global human rights agenda. Scott Busby, who represents the White House, essentially chuckled and said, well, you know, those recommendations came from Cuba, and they don't have such a good human rights record. Well, fortunately, we were joined by the International Indian Treaty Council, who pointed out that neither does the United States. In fact, that's why we were all sitting in that room having this discussion. And on that basis, the United States could not afford, if it was going to attempt to maintain the myth of the gold standard of human rights compliance and its campaign to quote-unquote lead by example, discount a recommendation because it came from a country that it did not like. However, it was patently clear that the decision, while we were being humored with this so-called consultation, had already been made that those recommendations would not be considered. There is nothing that happens in this country that has not been assessed, planned, and implemented for purposes far beyond and above the interests of the people who live here or any place else on the planet. This weekend, we are engaged in what we call a blitz on the White House, not because we think that we can convince them to adopt the resolutions, but because we want to impress upon them that we will not be silent. We must expand this conversation to not only object to their interring more political prisoners, but demanding that they release the ones they already hold.
So our last speaker is Diane Methowitz. She's a retired auto worker from Atlanta who worked at GM for 30 years on the assembly line. She's currently the coordinator of the Atlanta International Action Center. In the early 2000s, she was a part of a labor delegation to Colombia and has been a part of numerous protests against Coca-Cola in support of the Colombian workers. Diane was at the very first School of the Americas protest in Fort Benning, Georgia, and she has been to nearly every one since. So welcome, Diane.
There's one thing about being the last after a terrific panel that many of the points obviously have already been made. I'm really going to just sort of talk a little bit, though, about Colombia in particular and the School of the Americas. So while this conference is talking about FBI repression, it should be clear my starting point and my ending point will be that throughout the history of the United States, regardless of what political party was in office and controlled the agencies of government, that the sole purpose of that government and of those agencies has always been the suppression of political resistance to the rule of one class, owners, whether they were slave owners, capitalist owners, over the others, whether they were slaves or our workers. So that's how I start, and that's how I'll be ending. So one of the things I think we need to note again is that, for example, we're talking about FBI repression of political solidarity activists in the current period around FARC. But the role of the United States in regards to Latin America, goes back hundreds of years. So just a little history lesson. I'm going to throw a bunch of dates out. So in 1819, Simón Bolívar declared the independence of what was called Gran Colombia, which is a much larger landmass and which is now the countries of Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. We all heard about that in school. Perhaps we didn't really understand what it meant. It meant that the United States declared to the other colonial powers, England and France and the others, that Latin America, Central and Latin America, was the U.S. sphere of influence. They should stay out. The United States was going to be the dominant entity, was going to be the master. I'm going to jump a whole bunch of years. 1948, you would be surprised, would we all not, to know that the CIA engineered a coup, 1948, in Colombia, that created a 10-year civil war where 300,000 Colombians died. So when we talk about this, we're not talking about something that just happened this decade. We're talking about something that is of hundreds of years of U.S. interference and involvement and imperialism. 1964, the people of Colombia, this is the same thing, this generations and generations of resistance. In 1964, peasants had organized around the oligarchy, the fact they had no land and they were poor. And the government at that time launched an air and land attack on these peasant communities. This date is important because that is considered the official birth of this organization, FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. The same year, another guerrilla organization, the ELN, was formed. 1964, many of you in this room were not yet born, 1964. 1985, after almost 20 years of guerrilla struggle, the FARC backs the creation of a leftist political party. It was called the Patriotic Union, There were elections the next year, and in municipalities, in the government of Colombia, representatives of that party won seats. But 86, the next year, the CIA and the Colombian military established something called the Condor Plan. And it essentially was in response to the fact that progressives, whether they were trade unionists, women, peasant organizations, students, had actually gotten electoral seats. It was an assassination plan.